In section 2 of the Federalism chapter, we're taking a look at essential question number 15, which is, what was the impact of the Marshall Court on federalism? So there's three major cases that take place during the Marshall era. Chief Justice John Marshall was the second Supreme Court justice, but he was probably the most impactful of the Supreme Court justices. In addition to Marbury versus Madison, where he grasped for the court the power of judicial review, he also ruled on three cases. They ruled on three cases that set the framework for the distribution of power between the states and the national government. Remember, the Constitution spoke of powers of Congress and spoke of powers retained by the states, but it didn't clearly delineate who had all the powers. And so that was something that needed to be worked out, and the Supreme Court seemed the apt institution to do so. The three cases we're going to take a look at in this section are McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, and Barron versus Baltimore. In McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court upheld the power of the national government and denied the right of a state to tax the federal bank using the Constitution's supremacy clause. The court's broad interpretation of the necessary and proper clause paved the way for later rulings upholding expansive federal power. This was the first Supreme Court case to define the balance between state and federal government power. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. In 1818, Maryland decided they were going to tax all banks not chartered by the state of Maryland. And so that included the Second Bank of the United States. They required the banks that were in the state but not chartered by Maryland to buy stamped paper from Maryland to write banknotes on, and to pay $15,000 a year or simply go out of business. The head cashier for the Second Bank of the United States in Maryland refused to pay, and Maryland sued him. Maryland won in Maryland court, not surprisingly, and so appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS means Supreme Court of the United States. Why could they go from state court to federal court? Because if it is a federal issue, once it's gone through the state court system and reaches the state's highest court, it can then jump to the Supreme Court. Additionally, you didn't really have much of a federal court system here at this point because it's only 1819. So the Supreme Court had to decide two things. They had to decide, can Congress charter a bank? That's a big one. And then two, it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that they can charter a bank. And then two, if yes, can states tax it? Here is what the Marshall Court said. Based on the implied powers doctrine, so using the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause, Marshall held that because the Constitution's enumerated powers give Congress the authority to levy and collect taxes, to issue currency, to borrow funds, it was reasonable to imply that Congress had the power to charter a bank, which could be considered necessary and proper to exercising the enumerated powers. In other words, because they had all these financial powers, it made sense for them to have a mechanism to take advantage of those financial powers, and that mechanism was the bank. So, in other words, he was saying that the power to charter a bank was implied in those other powers, right? And furthermore, that in order for Congress to execute its powers, to execute the power to collect taxes, to issue currency, to borrow funds, they needed a bank, and therefore the bank was necessary and proper. Next, he held that because the national government was dependent on the people and not the states, in other words, its power came from the people, not the states, and because the Constitution makes the national law makes national law supreme, the supremacy clause, the states can never tax the national government. So because of the supremacy clause and because the national government is supreme, the states can never tax the national government. Taxing the national government would interfere with the operations of the government. This has consequences that reverberate. This case has consequences that reverberate even to today. The elastic clause, for one, is used to justify all kinds of laws. For instance, even social welfare programs are on the basis of the necessary and proper clause rather than an enumerated power. And then furthermore, allowing Maryland to tax the federal government would have opened the door to taxing all federal programs, making the cost of government even higher, and making the national government relatively ineffective if the state started to tax pretty much everything that they did. The second case is a case called Gibbons versus Ogden. In Gibbons versus Ogden, the Supreme Court held that the broad congressional power to regulate interstate commerce was upheld. And the court's broad interpretation of the Constitution's Commerce Clause power paved the way for later rulings upholding expansive federal power. So basically what happens here is New York grants Robert Fulton, the steamboat guy, the guy who invented the steamboat, the exclusive right to operate steamboats on the Hudson River. Congress then licenses a ship to sail on those same waters. New Jersey also wanted control of shipping on the lower Hudson. And so the question becomes, what was Congress's authority here under the Commerce Clause? The state argued that commerce means only direct dealings in products. The Marshall Court held, in other words, they ruled, that Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce includes the power to regulate commercial activity, not just products, as well, and that the only limit on the commerce power were those specifically found in the Constitution. So in other words, they ruled that the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce was extensive. And so they argued that New York specifically couldn't grant a monopoly because it interferes with interstate commerce. All right, and then the final case is a case called Barron versus Baltimore. If the other two cases we've looked at expanded the power of the federal government, this one sort of restricts it a little bit. In Barron versus Baltimore, the Supreme Court ruled that due process clause of the Fifth Amendment did not apply to the actions of states. This decision limited the Bill of Rights to actions taken by the national government alone. So what happened here is Barron owned a docking business off the city's wharf. He owned a dock. Over time, the state of Maryland and Baltimore started building and building buildings and roads at a high rate. And because of the construction, the city began to inadvertently deposit dirt, sand, and silt into the wharf and made his wharf, Barron's wharf, his dock, unusable. So he argued that the city took his land, the Fifth Amendment, and did not give him just compensation, which is guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment. Yes, the state can take your property, but if they take your property, they must provide you with just compensation. The Marshall Court ruled that there was no federal claim here, that they couldn't bring the case in the federal court system, and they couldn't base it on the Fifth Amendment because the actor, the government taking his wharf, his dock, was the state rather than the federal government. So basically, they said that the states were free to add rights or ignore them altogether when it comes to the federal Constitution. And so that's it with the Marshall Court. That's it for Section 2. And so you're going to go on to the you're going to go on to Google Classroom. You're going to go on to the Essential Question Comp Check, and you're going to answer Essential Question 15. What was the impact of the Marshall Court on federalism? And just to recap, basically, the federal courts, these three federal cases, the first two sort of expand the power of the federal government. They say that the national law is supreme. They say that that Congress can act pursuant to the necessary and proper clause. They say where the states are interfering with a congressional power, the congressional power is always going to win. And then finally, they sort of restrict that power a little bit in Barron versus Baltimore, saying that the federal Constitution does not protect individuals from state action. It only protects individuals from federal action.